The virgin rancher turned 40 alone until the Chinese widow asked, "Can I stay tonight?" From the time he was a boy, he had learned to rise with the sun, smell the morning air thick with the scent of wet grass, and hear the distant lowing of cattle across the fields. Life on the ranch was never easy, but it had a steady honesty that David respected. Each fence post he drove into the hard earth, each barn roof he repaired, each herd he tended, was a reminder that work mattered. It was tangible, and the results could be seen and measured. It was a life that demanded effort but rewarded perseverance. By the time David reached 40, he had spent more than half of his life on the ranch. His hands were calloused from years of labor, and his skin was weathered by the Montana sun. He had learned to take pride in the small details, the way a calf's coat glistened in the morning light, the satisfaction of mending a fence that had fallen during the winter storms, the quiet beauty of the sky at sunset. He was known in the small town nearby as a dependable man. People trusted him, respected his hard work, but very few really knew him. David's life had been marked by solitude. It wasn't that he disliked people, but intimacy had always felt complicated. As a young man, he had been shy and unsure, often tongue-tied around women he liked. There had been a few attempts at romance in his 20s, but they never went beyond nervous conversations and awkward dates. Each rejection, each failed connection, had chipped away at his confidence until he had decided it was easier to focus on the ranch and leave romance behind. He told himself that he was happy this way, but in quiet moments, a soft ache of loneliness would make itself known. Evenings were the hardest. After a long day, the chores completed and the barn quiet, David would sit alone in the kitchen, listening to the wind whip through the open plains. The house was old, full of memories, but also full of silence. Sometimes he would glance at the family photos lining the walls, pictures of his parents and grandparents, and wonder what it would have been like to share these moments with someone else. The thought would linger, then vanish under the weight of routine. Life had a rhythm here, a simplicity that was comforting and yet isolating. The town nearby often reminded him of what he had missed. He would see couples walking together on Main Street, laughing, sharing stories, holding hands. Friends would occasionally ask why he hadn't settled down, why he spent his life alone. David would smile politely, shrug, and offer some vague explanation about being busy with the ranch. But inside, he felt a quiet sting. At times, he wondered if he had missed his chance, if turning 40 without having loved or been loved was a failure. But he never let anyone see that side of him. David had learned to keep his feelings private, wrap them tightly within the walls of his home and heart. Yet the ranch was not just a place of work, it was a companion. The creak of the barn doors, the soft nuzzle of a calf, the distant call of a hawk, these were his friends. He had a rhythm and companionship in routine. Every morning he would rise before dawn, put on his boots and step outside into the cold Montana air. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange, and the fields shimmered with frost. He would check the fences, feed the animals, and make his way through the day with the kind of steady focus that only someone deeply in tune with the land could understand. He remembered vividly one winter when a blizzard had trapped him inside the barn for 2 days. The snow piled high, wind howling like a wild animal. He had little food, but he had the animals to care for, and that sense of responsibility had kept him going. He had survived, and when the storm ended, he felt an indescribable pride in his ability to endure. Life on the ranch was hard, yes, but it was honest, and it taught lessons that nothing else could. Despite his dedication, there was a part of him that longed for something more. Not excitement, not adventure, not even romance at first, but companionship, someone to share the quiet victories and small frustrations with, someone who understood the rhythm of the land and the life he had chosen. Over the years, he had pushed that longing aside, burying it beneath chores, routines, and the call of responsibility. Yet sometimes, late at night, he would hear a laugh somewhere in town, a sound of life, and feel the ache of emptiness. David's life was full of small joys. He loved watching the sun rise and set, the way the snow blanketed the fields in winter, and the green promise of spring. He cherished the animals that depended on him, the loyal dogs that followed him everywhere, and the quiet solitude of the land. But these joys were tinged with loneliness. On special occasions, holidays, birthdays, he would eat alone, often making an extra plate just in case someone stopped by, though no one ever did. He had grown accustomed to this pattern, though a part of him wondered what it would be like to share a meal with someone who cared. Even in town, he remained a figure of quiet respect. People would nod and greet him warmly, acknowledging his work and reliability, but very few ventured beyond small talk. David had never been confrontational or rude, yet there was a certain invisible wall around him, a distance born of decades of solitude and habit. People assumed he preferred it this way, and for the most part he did. But there was also a secret wish for connection, buried deep and rarely acknowledged, even to himself. As David turned 40, he felt the years weigh on him in a new way. There was a subtle shift in his perception of time, an awareness that life was moving forward, and he had spent most of it alone. The realization was not crushing, but it was sobering. He could not help but imagine what his life might have been if he had dared to take chances, if he had allowed himself to be vulnerable, if he had allowed love to enter his world. These thoughts were fleeting, often replaced by the immediacy of ranch work, the practicalities of daily life. Yet, somewhere in the quiet corners of his mind, a small hope remained, a whisper that perhaps life still had surprises in store. The ranch itself mirrored his solitude. It was a large property with rolling hills, dense patches of forest, and wide-open pastures. He had inherited it from his father, who had taught him everything he knew about cattle, crops, and the unforgiving nature of rural life. Each barn, fence, and field held memories of years gone by. He worked the land with dedication, knowing that it was both a sanctuary and a responsibility. It provided him sustenance, purpose, and a sense of identity, but it could not provide the human connection he sometimes craved. David's nights were long and quiet. He would often sit by the fireplace, the crackling logs filling the room with warmth and soft light. He would read occasionally, mostly about ranching techniques, history, or nature. Sometimes he would simply stare out the window, watching the moon rise over the fields, listening to the distant sounds of wildlife. In these moments, he felt a strange mix of peace and yearning. Peace because he was safe, secure, and in control of his world. Yearning because he realized that he was profoundly alone. Yet, despite all this, David did not feel bitter or regretful. He had lived his life according to his own rules, and there was honor in that. He had chosen his solitude consciously, and he had embraced it with discipline. He found beauty in the small routines of life, in the cycle of seasons, in the trust between him and the animals he cared for. He had not lived a conventional life, but it was authentic, and it was his. Still, the feeling of loneliness was never far away. Sometimes it was a quiet shadow at the edge of his days. Sometimes it was a sharp pang during particularly long or silent nights. It was not something that could be fixed with chores or routine. It was a part of him, shaped by years of solitude and the choices he had made. Yet David remained hopeful, even if only in small, almost imperceptible ways. There was a part of him that believed, deep down, that life might still hold unexpected surprises, moments of connection that could transform his quiet, solitary world. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, David continued his life on the ranch. He rose with the sun, tended to his animals, maintained the fences, and watched the sky with its endless horizons. He embraced the peace and the solitude, but he never fully let go of the possibility that one day, someone might enter his life and share it with him. That quiet hope, fragile but persistent, was the one thing that kept the edges of his world from feeling completely closed. David Miller, the rancher who had turned 40 alone, was a man of routine, responsibility, and silent longing. His life was simple, honest, and full of hard work. Yet beneath the calm exterior, beneath the calloused hands and weathered skin, was a heart that yearned quietly for companionship, for connection, for the warmth of another human soul. And though he did not yet know it, the winds of change were about to blow across the plains of his life, bringing with them a visitor who would challenge everything he had known about love, trust, and the beauty of unexpected friendship. It was a late autumn evening when the unexpected knock came at David's door. The sky had turned a deep gray, and a cold drizzle tapped against the wooden roof of the farmhouse. David had been inside, finishing up chores that had taken longer than usual. His boots were muddy, and his jacket carried the faint scent of the damp earth outside. The knock startled him. Visitors were rare. Neighbors rarely came out this far, especially at this hour. David paused for a moment, listening. There it was again, soft but deliberate. He wiped his hands on a rag, adjusted his jacket, and stepped to the door. Through the dim light of the porch, he saw a woman standing in the rain. She was tall, slender, with dark hair that clung to her face from the rain, and eyes that held both caution and quiet determination. She carried a small bag which looked heavy for her frame. "Good evening," she said in a gentle, accented voice. "I'm sorry to bother you. My car, it broke down a little ways back. I've been trying to find a place to stay for the night, but everything in town is full. Could I stay here just for tonight?" It was rare for anyone to come to his door asking for anything, and even rarer for someone to ask so directly. He noticed something in her eyes, a mix of weariness and calm, as if she had faced hardships and carried on despite them. He also noticed the small tremor in her hands as she held the bag. He hesitated, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. He wasn't used to strangers and certainly not women asking for hospitality, but something in her tone softened him. She wasn't demanding, just asking. There was no sense of entitlement, no expectation, just a quiet need. "All right," he said finally, opening the door wider. "Come in. You'll catch your death out here." The warmth of the farmhouse greeted her, and she let out a small sigh. David offered her a towel, which she accepted with a smile, dabbing at her damp hair. She introduced herself as Mrs. Lee, a widow who had recently moved to Montana to be closer to her daughter. Her husband had passed several years ago, and since then she had been managing life on her own. Her English was good, though accented, and her calm voice carried a sense of dignity and resilience. David led her to the living room, where he set out a few chairs and a small table. He offered her some hot tea, which she accepted with a grateful nod. For a moment, they sat quietly, listening to the rain tapping against the windows, the wind rustling through the trees outside. The silence was comfortable, not awkward, a rare quality for David, who often felt that silence was heavy and oppressive when shared with strangers. "I usually don't have visitors," David said finally, his voice low but steady. "You're welcome to stay, but I should warn you it's just a simple home, no fancy rooms or comforts. I only need a place to rest. I do not mind simple." After a brief dinner, which David prepared simply, roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and fresh bread, Mrs. Lee spoke a little about herself. She told him about her life in China, the small city where she had grown up, the family she had loved, and the husband she had lost. Her stories were filled with both sorrow and strength, and David listened intently. He rarely allowed anyone into the corners of his mind, yet her voice invited openness without forcing it. David found himself sharing in small ways too. He talked about the ranch, about the routines and responsibilities that shaped his life. He didn't speak much of his loneliness, but he allowed glimpses of his inner world to show, how he enjoyed the quiet, how he respected the land, how the rhythm of ranch life gave him both purpose and comfort. As the evening deepened, the wind outside grew stronger, rattling the old windows. The farmhouse creaked and groaned, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the presence of another human being made the space feel alive. For the first time in years, David felt a strange sense of connection, a subtle reminder that life could shift in unexpected ways. Mrs. Lee's eyes were observant, gentle. She noticed the details of the house, the well-worn furniture, the photos on the wall, the meticulous way the kitchen was arranged. She asked questions not out of nosiness but curiosity and kindness. "Did you always live here?" she asked. "Yes," David replied simply. "I grew up here, inherited it from my father. It's home." "I can see why you stayed." They spoke of small things, her favorite foods, the types of flowers she liked, the weather in Montana compared to China. There was laughter too, quiet and gentle, as they shared stories of misunderstandings, mispronounced words, and minor misadventures. David found himself smiling more than he had in a long time. It was not a loud or boisterous smile, but one that came from the heart. When it grew late, David showed Mrs. Lee the small guest room upstairs. She thanked him politely, placed her bag on the bed, and prepared for sleep. Before leaving the room, she turned back to him and said, "Thank you for letting me stay. You are very kind." After she left, David lingered in the living room. He stared at the fire, feeling the quiet shift in the air. Something had changed. Her presence, though brief, had introduced a new energy into his life. It was not dramatic or overwhelming, but it was undeniable. He realized, perhaps for the first time in decades, that he had been closed off, not just from people, but from the possibility of connection, of friendship, of companionship. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The world outside glistened with wet leaves and fresh puddles. David went about his chores as usual, but the memory of the previous night lingered. There was a lightness in his step, a subtle curiosity about the woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly. As the days passed, Mrs. Lee's presence became a gentle, recurring thread in the quiet tapestry of his life. She would visit occasionally, bringing small gifts from town or sharing meals she had prepared. At first, David was cautious, wary of letting someone too close, but slowly he began to look forward to her visits. There was no pressure, no expectation, only a simple friendship that grew quietly, naturally, with each shared laugh, each story told, each moment of genuine attention. David noticed the little ways she adapted to ranch life. She was eager to learn, patient, and unafraid to get her hands dirty. Together, they mended fences, fed the animals, and tended to the small garden near the house. Sometimes, she would ask questions about the routines he followed, the reasons behind his careful attention to detail. David would explain patiently, and in doing so, he found himself speaking in ways he hadn't spoken in years, open, reflective, even vulnerable. It was in these small moments that the bond began to take shape. It was not immediate, not dramatic, but steady and enduring. They found comfort in each other's presence, a quiet companionship that neither had expected. For David, it was a revelation. He realized that he had been capable of warmth and openness all along, but the walls he had built over the years had prevented it from being shared. Mrs. Lee, too, seemed to find solace in his presence. She shared stories of her past, her late husband, and the challenges of moving to a new country. David listened without judgment, offering quiet support and understanding. There was no rush, no urgency, just a slow, steady weaving of trust and friendship. Evenings at the ranch began to feel different. David would prepare simple dinners and find that conversation flowed more easily than it had with anyone else in years. The silence, once heavy and oppressive, became a comfortable companion when shared with her. There was laughter, occasional teasing, and the quiet satisfaction of two people finding understanding in one another's company. And though they had not yet crossed the line into romance, there was a growing awareness, a subtle tension in the air that both sensed. It was in the way they looked at each other during work, the way they shared meals, the small gestures of kindness that carried unspoken meaning. They were discovering that human connection could be simple, gentle, and profound, even when it arrived unexpectedly. By the end of the second week, David felt a shift within himself. The loneliness that had once defined his life had softened. He realized that opening his door to a stranger, allowing her into his home and life, had begun to transform him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The ranch, once a sanctuary of solitude, had become a place of subtle joy, warmth, and the possibility of connection. David Miller, the solitary rancher, had been alone for 40 years. Yet in the gentle presence of Mrs. Lee, he began to understand that life had more to offer than work, routine, and quiet solitude. A new chapter was beginning, one filled with hope, companionship, and the delicate promise of something neither of them could yet define, but both were beginning to feel. The days turned into weeks, and the quiet bond between David and Mrs. Lee grew stronger. It was not sudden or dramatic. It was built slowly, gently, in the way that trust and understanding often grow. David noticed the changes first in himself. He felt lighter, more at ease in his own home. The house, which had once felt empty and silent, now held a warmth that was hard to describe. It was in the small things. The sound of her laughter echoing softly in the kitchen, the way she would leave a steaming cup of tea by the fire, the careful attention she paid to the animals as if they, too, were part of her world. Mrs. Lee adapted to the rhythm of ranch life with remarkable ease. She was willing to learn, patient, and attentive. David had expected her to struggle with the chores, the feeding of cattle, the fixing of fences, the daily upkeep. But she approached each task with quiet determination. Sometimes she would make mistakes, misjudge the strength needed to lift a gate or spill feed from the bucket, and they would both laugh. It was laughter that was different from the polite smiles David had shared with townsfolk or the forced amusement of acquaintances. This laughter was warm, genuine, and healing. One morning, as the first light of dawn stretched across the prairie, David found Mrs. Lee kneeling by the garden, examining the small shoots of vegetables sprouting from the soil. The frost had not yet left the ground, and she was carefully brushing it away, her hands steady and patient. "You have a good garden," she said softly, looking up. "It is alive, even in the cold. Quiet, steady, and full of care. It grows even if no one notices." It was as if she saw not just the work, but the man behind it, the quiet devotion, the honesty, and the heart that he rarely let anyone glimpse. As the days passed, they shared more than just work. They shared stories, memories, and dreams. Mrs. Lee spoke of her late husband, of the life they had built together, and the grief she had carried alone. She spoke not with bitterness, but with a gentle acceptance, a quiet resilience that was both inspiring and humbling. David, in turn, allowed glimpses of his own heart, of the loneliness that had shaped him, the small hopes he had never voiced, the dreams he had set aside in the name of practicality. Evenings became their time to connect. They would sit by the fire, sometimes with tea, sometimes with a simple supper, and talk about the events of the day. The conversations were easy, unforced, flowing naturally from one topic to another. Sometimes there was silence, comfortable and warm, broken only by the crackling of the fire or the occasional hoot of an owl outside. In these moments, David realized how rare such connection was in his life. It was not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about being seen, being understood, and being allowed to exist fully in the presence of another person. One afternoon, as they were repairing a section of fence, Mrs. Lee paused and wiped her hands on her apron. "David," she said, her voice hesitant but steady, "I think I feel at home here, more than I expected." Yet here she was, and her presence was changing the landscape of his world in ways he had not anticipated. Their friendship deepened as they learned more about each other's lives. David discovered that Mrs. Lee had faced countless challenges moving to a new country alone, learning the language, adapting to new customs, and managing her grief while caring for her daughter. She had strength, courage, and wisdom, and David found himself admiring her in ways that went beyond simple friendship. He was drawn not only to her kindness, but to her resilience, her ability to find beauty and hope even after loss. They shared quiet adventures too. Sometimes they would ride together across the ranch on horseback, checking the cattle and enjoying the open landscape. The wind in their hair, the sun on their faces, and the endless horizon brought a sense of freedom that both cherished. They would talk about the sky, the land, the weather, and sometimes nothing at all, simply enjoying each other's company. It was in these moments that David felt a sense of companionship he had never known, a feeling that perhaps life had more to offer than routine and solitude. One evening, while cooking supper together, Mrs. Lee accidentally spilled a pot of soup. David laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that startled him with its own sound. She joined in, her laughter mixing with his, creating a harmony that felt natural and easy. "I'm sorry," she said between chuckles. "I'm still learning." "No harm done." He would notice the empty chair at the kitchen table, the silence of the living room, and a quiet longing would rise within him. It was not desperation, but awareness, a recognition that her presence had become an integral part of his life. The realization both excited and unnerved him. He had spent so long alone that the idea of feeling this closeness was almost unfamiliar. Mrs. Lee, too, seemed affected by the growing bond. She would bring small gifts from town, little tokens of thoughtfulness, and David noticed the way her eyes lingered on him when she spoke. There was a subtle energy between them, unspoken but undeniable. It was not yet love in its fullest sense, but it was the beginning, a spark that had been ignited through shared time, mutual respect, and genuine care. One afternoon, while tending to the cattle, a sudden storm approached. Dark clouds gathered quickly, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. They hurried to bring the animals into shelter, working side by side, their movements coordinated through unspoken understanding. Afterward, soaked and tired, they found themselves laughing, their laughter mingling with the sound of the rain and wind. In that moment, David realized that life could be unpredictable, messy, and challenging, yet filled with beauty when shared with someone who understood and supported you. Evenings continued to be a time of quiet reflection and conversation. They would talk about their childhoods, their families, and the moments that had shaped them. David shared memories of his father teaching him to ride, to care for the land, and to respect the animals. Mrs. Lee spoke of her parents, the lessons they had instilled in her, and the love she had carried for her late husband. Through these stories, they learned not just about each other, but about the values, experiences, and hearts that had led them to this point in life. The bond between them grew stronger, built on trust, shared experiences, and mutual respect. There were moments of quiet intimacy, long glances, small gestures of kindness, and the comforting presence of knowing that someone cared deeply. Neither rushed the relationship, understanding that trust and connection took time to develop. It was a slow, deliberate process, but one that felt natural and right. David began to notice subtle changes in himself. He smiled more freely, laughed more easily, and found joy in the simplest moments. The loneliness that had once been a constant companion began to fade, replaced by a sense of possibility and hope. He realized that opening his life to another person, even cautiously, had begun to transform him in ways he had not anticipated. Mrs. Lee's presence also brought a sense of grounding and balance. She was patient and understanding, never forcing affection or attention, yet offering it freely when it was natural. Together, they navigated the rhythms of the ranch, the seasons, and the small challenges of daily life. Their companionship was steady, comforting, and deeply fulfilling. One quiet evening after a long day of work, they sat by the fire, sipping tea in companionable silence. David looked at her, noticing the soft lines of her face, the kindness in her eyes, and the gentle confidence she carried. He felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of gratitude for her presence and for the connection they had built. "I never expected this," he said softly, almost to himself. "Expected what?" she asked, looking up. This friendship, this comfort. I didn't think life could change so quietly, yet so completely." Life has a way of surprising us when we are ready to see it. Lee by his side, he began to see a world that was richer, warmer, and more full of possibility than he had ever imagined. The ranch, the work, and the solitude remained central to his life, but they were no longer all-consuming. There was now space for laughter, conversation, and companionship. David and Mrs. Lee had created a bond that was strong, steady, and deeply meaningful. A bond built not on grand gestures or dramatic events, but on shared time, mutual understanding, and the simple, profound act of being present for one another. And so, the days continued, filled with quiet joy, laughter, and the steady building of trust. David's life had changed in ways he had never anticipated, and he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The connection they had nurtured, gentle and unassuming, was growing into something that neither of them could yet define but both could feel, a warmth, a hope, and the quiet promise of something beautiful. The arrival of spring brought a new sense of life to the ranch. The fields turned green, the calves grew stronger, and the mornings became warmer with sunlight spilling across the hills. For David, these changes mirrored what had been happening quietly within him. His world, once steady but solitary, now felt fuller, warmer, and richer than it had in decades. The presence of Mrs. Lee had transformed not just his days but his heart. The friendship they had built over the weeks had deepened into something more subtle but unmistakable. There was a growing awareness, a gentle tension in the air, a quiet longing neither had yet spoken aloud. They had shared so much: work, stories, laughter, small victories, and the challenges of life. But now there was a new layer to their connection. David found himself noticing her in ways that went beyond friendship. The soft curve of her smile, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, the calm confidence she carried even in unfamiliar situations. One afternoon, as they worked together in the fields, Mrs. Lee paused to adjust a fence post. She looked at him and said quietly, "David, I am glad I came here. I never imagined I could feel so at home somewhere new." It was a bond of trust, respect, and deepening affection. They returned to work, but the air between them had shifted slightly, infused with a quiet promise that was both thrilling and comforting. Evenings continued to be their time of connection. They would prepare dinner together, the kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh ingredients and laughter. Sometimes they would sit by the fire afterward, sharing stories about their childhoods, their families, and the lessons life had taught them. David began to speak more openly than ever before, revealing hopes, fears, and dreams he had kept buried for years. Mrs. Lee listened patiently, offering encouragement, understanding, and gentle insight. One evening, after a long day of work and a hearty meal, David found himself staring into the fire, thinking about how much had changed. He realized that he had been lonely for so long, not because people were absent, but because he had built walls around his heart. Mrs. Lee's presence had begun to tear down those walls, not forcefully, but gently, with patience and kindness. He felt the unfamiliar stirrings of love, and instead of fear, there was hope. Mrs. Lee, too, seemed affected by the growing bond. She would bring small gifts from town, thoughtful gestures that showed she cared. She shared her favorite recipes, introduced David to Chinese traditions, and slowly the ranch began to feel like a place where two lives could coexist harmoniously. There was laughter, shared responsibility, and a sense of mutual support that neither had expected but both cherished deeply. One warm afternoon, they took a break from chores and sat under the shade of a large oak tree. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting soft patterns on the ground. David noticed the way her hair caught the light, the gentle tilt of her head as she spoke, and felt a sense of admiration that went beyond friendship. "Mrs. Lee," he began hesitantly, I feel different these days. I feel happy, more than I have in a long time. But I am happy too." And now it could take the next step. Over the following weeks, their bond continued to grow. They shared more intimate moments, long walks through the fields, quiet conversations by the fireplace, and gentle touches that conveyed warmth and affection without words. David found himself thinking about her constantly, anticipating her presence and feeling a sense of completeness that he had never experienced before. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant hues of orange and pink, David finally spoke what he had felt for weeks. "Mrs. Lee, I care for you. More than I expected, more than I can explain. You have changed my life, and I think I love you." Lee's eyes softened and she reached for his hand. "David, I care for you too. I was afraid to hope, but I feel the same. You have shown me kindness, patience, and understanding, and in return I have come to love you." They embraced, feeling the warmth of each other's presence, the shared joy of discovering love later in life, and the quiet certainty that they had found something rare and beautiful. From that moment on, their lives intertwined more deeply. Mrs. Lee began staying at the ranch more regularly, and together they managed the routines, responsibilities, and joys of daily life. David found that love did not take away his independence or the life he had built. Instead, it enhanced it, filling his world with warmth, laughter, and shared purpose. They celebrated milestones quietly but meaningfully, birthdays, holidays, and simple achievements on the ranch. Each moment was an opportunity to deepen their bond and create new memories. David found joy in sharing his life fully, without fear, and Mrs. Lee found a sense of home and belonging she had not known since the loss of her husband. Their love was not about grand gestures or dramatic events. It was about presence, understanding, and mutual respect. It was in the way they supported each other during challenges, laughed together during light-hearted moments, and found comfort in shared silence. Life had taught them both resilience, patience, and the value of small, consistent acts of care. Together, they embodied these lessons, creating a partnership that was strong, steady, and deeply fulfilling. One spring morning, as the cattle grazed peacefully and the sun rose over the hills, David and Mrs. Lee sat together on the porch sipping tea. He looked at her, noticing the soft expression on her face, the quiet strength she carried, and the love that had grown between them. "I never thought life could be like this," he said softly. "Neither did I," she replied, taking his hand. "But I am grateful it is." The fields, the animals, and the land remained central to their existence, but now they shared them together, finding joy in the mundane, the ordinary, and the extraordinary alike. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, their relationship deepened further. They supported each other through challenges, stormy weather, difficult chores, and occasional setbacks in the ranch work. Yet in every challenge they found strength in one another. Their love was patient and enduring, built on the foundation of shared experiences, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that they were no longer alone. David realized that love had not changed who he was, it had enhanced him. He was still the dedicated rancher, still devoted to the land, still disciplined and responsible. But now he had someone to share his life with, someone who brought warmth, joy, and meaning to every day. Mrs. Lee, too, had found a sense of home, belonging, and happiness that had seemed elusive after years of loss. Together, they had created a life that was richer, fuller, and profoundly satisfying. Even simple moments, sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, tending the garden, or preparing a meal, became occasions for connection and love. They learned to communicate not just with words, but with gestures, glances, and shared experiences. Every day brought a small discovery, a moment of joy, or a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had built. As the story of David and Mrs. Lee unfolded, it became clear that life's beauty often arrives unexpectedly, quietly, and without fanfare. Love does not always follow a predictable path, nor does it always arrive at the time one expects. Sometimes, it comes to those who have lived long, full lives, waiting patiently until hearts are ready to embrace it. By the end of that spring, the ranch was no longer just David's world, it was their world. Together, they managed the routines, faced the challenges, and celebrated the joys of life on the plains. The connection they shared was deep, enduring, and profoundly transformative. David, the man who had turned 40 alone, had discovered that it is never too late to experience love, companionship, and the quiet joy of sharing life with someone who truly understands you. Mrs. Lee, the widow who had knocked on his door on a rainy evening, had become not just a guest, but a partner, a friend, and a companion. Her presence had brought warmth, laughter, and love to a life that had been quiet and solitary for far too long. Together, they had found a balance between independence and intimacy, work and joy, solitude and connection. And so, life on the ranch continued, richer and more meaningful than ever. The animals grazed peacefully, the fields flourished, and the house was filled with laughter, conversation, and quiet love. David and Mrs. Lee had discovered that life's greatest surprises often come when least expected, and that the doors we open, literally and metaphorically, can lead to transformations beyond our imagining. They had learned that love is not bound by age, circumstance, or expectation. It grows quietly, patiently, and with care, finding its way into hearts that are willing to accept it. David and Mrs. Lee had found each other, not in haste or drama, but through kindness, trust, and shared moments that wove their lives together into a tapestry of warmth, hope, and enduring love. And in that enduring love, they discovered the most profound truth of all. It is never too late for happiness, for connection, or for the quiet, life-changing presence of someone who makes your world brighter simply by being in it.